Hello and welcome. I am Zabraxi. You know what's fun about today's episode? I get to talk about a year that I wasn't even born in yet. Neat. The debate around when the first video game was made, or what is even allowed to be considered the first video game, will go on for seemingly quite a while. Today, we're gonna go ahead and dodge that particular conversation, and instead discuss things that are a bit more concrete. 1972 saw some amazing things. Yeah, bet you didn't think we were gonna start there given the title of the video. In 1972, The Godfather film was released, and it changed the landscape of the medium of movies. The United States finally gave Okinawa back to Japan, and Apollo 17 landed on that big rock in our sky. But who cares about all that stuff? This is the year that Pong came out. Who cares about something like Watergate when you could be in the arcade playing this? Beautiful. Keep in mind that this is the same year we also saw the release of the first ever home video game console. Who can honestly care about something minuscule like Australia passing a law to ensure equal pay to all women when the Magnavox Odyssey came out that year?
Odyssey easily attaches to any brand TV, black and white or color, to create a closed-circuit electronic playground.
How do you top this? It was around this time that Atari finally entered the scene. Little did they know, but Atari's 2600 console would become so influential on the video game market that it would both drive the potential future of the medium while also killing it. While the Atari 2600 had some incredible games for the time, if you thought the Wii had shovelware, oh boy, this might be the king of trash games. It was so bad that customers eventually had enough of it and tried returning their games and consoles in droves, causing the infamous video game crash of 1983. While this slice of time might have been horrific for video games, it was great for me. You see, this was the era where mommy and daddy Zabraxi would meet and start dating. They would spend a lot of their time at the arcades, which explains a lot about me, honestly. What? The arcades held a lot of good times for many people. While the home console scene effectively died the moment ET released, the arcades were still bringing in new players with new games that were pushing what the technology was capable of. This was the era where, as my mom puts it, my dad's free time was spent getting drunk and playing asteroids. Ugh, like father, like son, right, Pops? While we could spend an entire episode on the video game crash itself, the important part is that, well, it crashed. Things went bad. Profit in the industry plummeted, and arguably, most importantly, the customers' faith that they would receive quality products in future dwindled more and more. But the passion was still there. All it took was a couple more years, and everything would start to piece together just right. Like a phoenix from the ashes. It was 1985, and this was the rebirth of video games. There was an igniting of creativity, an artistic approach, and even business around the industry. A whole scope of legendary game studios opened up. Codemasters opened up shop to release countless home PC games during the 80s, and is now famously behind the absolutely wonderful grid and dirt racing games. We saw the creation of Westwood Studios, the team that brought us the BattleTech series and the absolutely legendary Command & Conquer games. This is even the year that Square was officially founded. Yeah, that Square. The one, that company that you both love and hate fervently at the same time? That company. Bethesda was spawned during '85 and is now a juggernaut of the industry, known most famously for releasing games that barely work. Oh, and we can't forget Titus Interactive, who would go on to create one of the most well-known games of all time, Superman 64. Man, this game is so bad. Well, we can't all be superheroes. There was some serious talent being cultivated during this time, and where it showed most was in the games. While the crash of '83 was derived from overpricing and abundant shovelware, 1985 propelled the medium leaps and bounds ahead of just a couple years prior. We saw amazing titles like the Oregon Trail drop for the first time. While it technically released in 1971, this was only a text version of the game. This here in 1985, though, is that famous Oregon Trail that we all know, aren't quite sure if we really love, but look at fondly nonetheless. This would be the new gold standard for education games, also known as edutainment. While we'd get things like Where in the World Was Carmen Sandiego years later, this Oregon Trail is the beast that paved it all. Thankfully, its legacy has not died of dysentery. Have you ever heard of Ultima? Yeah, even if you're like me and never played a single one, this name comes up constantly when discussing retro video games, especially on the PC front. This is a series that consists of about 15 games, and in 1985, Ultima 4, Quest of the Avatar, would make its debut and is constantly referenced as one of, if not the best Ultima title in the over 40-year-old series. Oh, and what about Tetris? Yeah, that Tetris. While this was actually released at the very end of 1984, it was 1985 where the USSR player base exploded with this new puzzle game. This was the year that started its momentum, and it still hasn't stopped. We're at the point in time where Tetris and all of its re-releases has hit over 200 million units sold. 200 million! And I don't own a single one of them. Does Kirby Star Stacker count though? Actually, let me rephrase that question. What the heck is Kirby Star Stacker? Ghosts and Goblins, Stack Up, 4D Warriors, Alpha Mission, King's Quest 2, Twin Bee, Commando, Gradius. Frickin' Gradius came out in 1985. This isn't it either. So many amazing titles came out at once. This year was plastered with so many good games, and in the case of Twin Bee and Gradius, equally amazing soundtracks as well. And then Hydlide 2 came out and the industry crashed again. Okay, that didn't happen, but thankfully this year was so damn good that it even withstood a Hydlide release. Whew, it was looking pretty fragile there for a sec. And if you're wondering if the innovation and creativity stopped there, then I guess it's finally time we talked about the giant elephant in the room. Space Harrier. Sega dropped one of the most impressive arcade advances the world had seen in quite some time. Space Harrier wasn't just an absolutely wonderful auto-scrolling arcade shooter. It wasn't just the impressive graphics. It wasn't just the mechanics that helped push this genre of game forward. Sure, all of those aspects of Space Harrier are incredibly important, and quite possibly how it can still stand up to this very day. However, if you visited the arcade personally and looked over at the Space Harrier cabinet, you'd see players in a cockpit bucking and leaning as they flew through the air. This is so cool. That's probably just the best way I can describe this. It's just cool. So all in all, 1985 was actually a pretty dang good year for video games. There was a lot of creativity, a lot of ingenuity that helped really prove that the industry had some longevity to it, despite its issues only a couple years earlier. But with that, I'm going to end today's episode, and I want to thank you all for joining so much. And Why? What? An NES game? Why the would you throw an NES game at me?
It was in the script.
Oh. Oh, well, keep up the good work then. The Nintendo Entertainment System. The NES. The Famicom. That toy. Despite actually releasing in Japan in 1983, the rest of the world wouldn't see this little guy until 1985. It was then that the craze we all know and love would begin. The Famicom started out with a bang, famously launching with, and say it with me now, Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr., and Popeye. That's definitely a bit off. That's all right. There was a slight problem in the transition from Japan to the West, though. The Famicom system was intentionally designed to look like a toy to attract buyers in the Japanese audience. But us Westerners, we're too mature for that. We don't like toys. We don't play with toys. We only play with action figures and giant gray blocks that look like VHS players. Oh, perfect. When the NES did eventually make its debut in New York City, it had a deluxe bundle that would help be a test batch to see the marketability of the United States. This was a great bundle that actually came with 2 games instead of 1. These 2 games were, and say it with me now, Duck Hunt, and I know you know this one, Gyromite. Yeah, seriously, Gyromite. This was in fact actually the first ever pack-in title that the West got for the NES, even agreed upon before Duck Hunt. In fact, it was pushed so quickly that if you boot this baby up, on the title screen you'll still see the Japanese name, Robot Gyro. That's a Nintendo seal of quality if I've ever seen one. It wasn't until the mass shipments of the NES when, finally, the console was bundled with the most famous game of all time, Super Mario Bros. This changed everything. To this day, World 1-1 of Mario is analyzed to understand the basic structure of level design and teaching through gameplay. Whether you consider Mario to be a product of its time or a masterpiece that deserves its legendary status, there's no doubting that Super Mario Bros. Changed the landscape of the industry forever. At the time, relatively amateur game designer Shigeru Miyamoto had tapped into something critical that would become the essential foundation for video games themselves. The idea of teaching through interactivity still permeates all forms of game design to this very day, whether video games or physical ones. While he was not the first to execute on such ideas, and in fact, humans had been executing on this for a long time, it was his creation of Super Mario Bros. In the video game sphere that opened the eyes of players around the world to a new style of play. From here on out, the principal game design element of high score would be questioned and countered and criticized, and eventually even removed from upcoming titles years later. It was now about solving puzzles and getting to the end. Granted, this philosophy would be challenged even further by Miyamoto's work himself the following year with The Legend of Zelda, which forced us all to focus on the journey even more than the destination. Regardless, the story of Super Mario Bros. Is legendary, and the NES itself has a story that is so rich and impactful. I won't be able to do it justice in this particular video, as that is a deep dive all on its own, but we all know the success of the Nintendo Entertainment System and Super Mario Bros. So, let's take a quick look at some of the other often forgotten releases that shaped the 1985 into potentially the most important year of video games. Here's a bit of a quick-fire list of the NES launch lineup. Duck Hunt is another game that I really don't have to actually spend too much time on. This is one of the most definitive, if not the definitive light gun games, and is genuinely one of the most addicting NES titles out there. Quick story, but I actually had someone nearby buy an extra CRT TV off me that I had because apparently his son wanted to play Duck Hunt with his dad for Christmas. That was so cute. Gyromite and Stack Up would release as excellently bad examples of how accessories could be for the NES. While Duck Hunt showed that the light gun was a perfect tool to go along for the NES, Gyromite and Stack Up proved that Rob the Robot was a great toy and nothing else. These games are cool in theory, but man, they are not actually fun to play. The NES also launched with some sports titles like baseball and golf and 10-Yard Fight and tennis. And yep, these are sports games. One of my favorite NES games, Excite Bike, was actually part of the US and EU NES launch lineup. What a super fun time this is. Also, a slight bit of trivia here if you don't know, but the engine that was used for Excite Bike is actually the same one that Nintendo would eventually use for Super Mario Bros. In fact, the rate of acceleration that propels Mario is almost identical to an Excite Bike. It's pretty cool. Hogan's Alley was another wonderful shooter that used the NES Sapper light gun, and this was developed by the now famous Intelligent Systems. It's always so weird hearing these giant industry names from so far back. This wasn't the only launch game they released either, and it's also not the only one that uses the NES Zapper. Wild Gunman was released in the US at launch as well, and similar to Hogan's Alley, for a launch game, it's a fantastic demonstration of what light gun games were capable of in the home rather than just the arcade. The NES launch also gave us Clu Clu Land, which was, in fact, a game that was released. We also got Pinball, which is exactly what you'd expect it to be, though the box art looks like Mario using a steel beam to protect himself from cotton balls. Wrecking Crew came out at this time as well. This is a fantastic puzzle game for the time, which also adds potential lore that Mario and Luigi were construction workers before they became plumbers. Neat. Oh, and let's not forget about Ice Climbers. Yeah, that was certainly something. Kung Fu is our final launch title for the NES, and certainly not the least. While nowhere near the best beat 'em up by today's standards, or heck, even by the 8-bit standards, this is an absolutely wonderful start for the genre on the NES. Kung Fu did a wonderful job setting the stage for some truly outstanding titles, such as Double Dragon, Battletoads, River City Ransom, and oh my god, why are you so damn expensive, Mighty Final Fight. While not every NES launch game was as industry-defining as Super Mario Bros. Or Duck Hunt, the Western lineup for the NES launch was the injection of life and hope that players needed at this time. Between the NES pushing the home console market in ways the world hadn't seen, and the arcade innovating with new and unique experiences, 1985 truly regained the trust of so many. While 1983 was the era of the video game crash, and oh boy did it crash hard, only a couple years later, the stage was set for a revival. This course correction wasn't just a testament of the designers at the time, but it also proved that video games themselves are capable of some astonishing things. Now, if only the industry can get this whole predatory monetization thing down. Look, if they're gonna take advantage of me, at least make it count. Bye-bye!